In a grand, opulent mansion nestled at the edge of a wealthy neighborhood, 45-year-old Naomi worked tirelessly as a maid, her hands accustomed to polishing silverware and cleaning the expansive rooms that belonged to the Brooks family, one of the wealthiest in the area. Naomi's own life had been far from easy. She was a black woman raised in a neighborhood where survival was often an uphill battle, and every day in the Brooks house was a constant reminder of the stark divide between the world she served and the life she could never truly belong to. Despite the vast wealth around her, Naomi had found a sense of purpose in her work, silently proud of the fact that she could offer for her children, putting them through school, even if she had to sacrifice her own dreams. Among the Brooks family was 16-year-old Ethan, the only son of the household. Ethan, unlike the other members of his family, had always felt like an outsider. His parents, self-absorbed and driven by their own ambitions, rarely paid attention to him, leaving Ethan to navigate a life of loneliness, expectation, and a growing sense of isolation. He often retreated to the privacy of his room, away from the social gatherings and events that took place in the house, where the wealth around him felt more like a cage than a gift. It was during one such evening, at an extravagant party hosted by his parents, that Ethan found himself trapped in a world he despised, surrounded by high society's superficial chatter, a glass of champagne in his hand, and the pressure of having to act like someone he was not. As he stepped out onto the balcony to escape, hoping for a moment of peace, he encountered a group of his peers, privileged teenagers who thought little of the people who worked for them. They immediately recognized Ethan and began taunting him, their voices mocking and cruel. They called him soft for not wanting to join in the party, questioning his worth because he didn't show the same entitled arrogance as the rest of them. They made fun of his reserved nature, calling him weak and unworthy of his family's legacy. As the insults began to escalate, Ethan stood there, frozen, unsure of how to defend himself against the barrage of cruelty. His heart raced, his throat tight, and for a moment, it felt as if he was suffocating under the weight of their words. That's when Naomi, who had been silently passing by on her way to the kitchen, heard the laughter and the taunts from outside. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her presence commanding in its quiet strength. She had never spoken to Ethan much before. Her role was simply to serve, and she knew her place, but in that moment, she saw a side of him that was different from the arrogant heir who had everything handed to him. Naomi's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough," she said, her words sharp and clear, carrying a weight that neither Ethan nor the others had anticipated. The teenagers paused, startled by the interruption, their faces turning to meet Naomi's steady gaze. Naomi, though she was aware of her low status in the house, had never been one to shrink away from injustice, no matter the source. She had endured her own share of discrimination and mistreatment in her life, but her dignity had always been her armor, and she wouldn't allow anyone, especially a vulnerable young boy, to be belittled on her watch. She walked toward the group, unflinching. "You think it's easy to be in his shoes? To live under the weight of expectations you can't control? You think it's funny to tear someone down because they're not like you? You should be ashamed of yourselves." The group of teenagers, once bold and brash, now stood in stunned silence. They had never seen Naomi like this before, her words not only filled with authority but with a wisdom born of lived experience. Ethan, his face flushed with embarrassment and gratitude, watched in awe as Naomi, a woman who worked in the shadows of his life, became his shield. For a brief moment, the walls of his isolated world seemed to crumble, and for the first time, he felt like someone truly saw him not as the son of a millionaire, not as a symbol of status, but as a person deserving of respect. The group of teens, their bravado deflated by Naomi's courage, slowly scattered, muttering under their breath. Naomi turned to Ethan, offering him a warm, understanding smile. She didn't need to say much more, her actions had spoken louder than any words could. Ethan stood there, his heart pounding, but now with a new sense of self. Naomi, despite all the ways she was told she was less than, had given him something priceless, the knowledge that strength comes in many forms. The realization that real courage wasn't about wealth or status, but about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed like the world was against you. From that day forward, the relationship between Naomi and Ethan changed. He no longer saw her as just the maid, but as someone who had become his protector, his ally, and someone who taught him that worth wasn't determined by the size of your bank account or the title you held, but by the integrity of your character. Naomi's quiet act of defiance, one that had no fanfare or recognition, had changed everything for Ethan. And in a house filled with gold and marble, it was her simple act of standing up that made him feel richer than he ever had before. David Sinclair had always prided himself on being a man of control, his life meticulously organized, his family a perfect reflection of his success. A billionaire businessman, he had built his empire from the ground up, and with that success came a level of privilege he'd long since become accustomed to. His wife, Caroline, shared in the wealth and comfort of their lavish home, raising their two children, Michael and Emily, in an environment of luxury. The family's household was run smoothly, with nannies, gardeners, and a team of cleaners ensuring everything was always in order. Among them was Maria, the quiet and kind maid who had been working for the family for years. She was a woman of modest means, always gentle and respectful, keeping her distance from the family but dedicated to her work. David, though always polite to her, barely noticed her presence beyond the tasks she carried out around the house. He'd never thought much of the staff after all, they were just people hired to maintain the household. But that all changed one afternoon when David returned home earlier than expected from a business trip. He walked into the house to the sound of laughter coming from the garden, something that was unusual for the usually somber household. Intrigued, he followed the sounds to the back door, where he paused in shock. There, in the middle of the garden, he saw his son Michael, who was just 15, sitting on the grass with Maria. The sight of them together was startling, not because of their age difference, but because of the intimacy of their interaction. Michael, usually so reserved and serious, was laughing freely with Maria, his head thrown back in a way David had never seen before. Maria, usually so professional, was smiling warmly, her posture relaxed and natural as she listened to Michael's jokes. David stood frozen, unable to make sense of what he was seeing. His mind raced as he tried to understand the scene in front of him. What was his son doing with Maria, alone in the garden? Why had Michael let his guard down so completely around her, someone he had always treated with indifference, as if she were invisible? David felt a surge of confusion and anger, but also a strange sense of guilt. His thoughts spiraled, questioning whether he had overlooked something important about his own family, whether he had been too focused on work to truly understand his children's lives. As he stood there, watching them, Maria caught sight of him. Her smile faltered, and she immediately stood up, straightening her clothes as though caught doing something wrong. Michael turned to follow her gaze and froze. There was an awkward moment of silence before David spoke, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "Michael," he said, his tone stern, "what's going on here?" Michael stood up quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment. Maria looked down at the ground, her hands wringing nervously. David's gaze shifted between the two, his mind struggling to find the right words, his sense of fatherly authority thrown into question. Maria was the first to speak, her voice soft but steady. "Mr. Sinclair, it's not what you think," she said, stepping forward slightly, though her eyes remained on the floor. "Michael and I were just talking. He's been having a hard time lately, and I was just trying to help." David's chest tightened. He had never seen his son so vulnerable, so open with someone outside the family. Michael, usually so composed and distant, had always been the child he thought he understood, but now, in this moment, David realized how little he knew about what was going on inside his son's heart. Michael, looking conflicted, finally spoke. "Dad, I didn't know who else to talk to," he said, his voice cracking. "I've been feeling lost. And Maria, she's always been here for me, listening when I needed someone. I didn't want to talk to you because I didn't think you'd understand." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. His son, the one he had tried so hard to guide and mold, had been carrying pain alone, isolated by the very walls of wealth and privilege David had built around him. It wasn't Maria's presence that shocked him, but the realization that his son had found solace in someone outside their world, someone who had been quietly watching over him when David wasn't paying attention. There was a long silence before David spoke again, his voice more composed, though still shaken. "I didn't know," he said, the words laced with both sorrow and regret. "I didn't know you were struggling." Michael didn't say anything in response, his eyes cast downward, and David could feel the distance between them widening, the gulf of missed opportunities and unspoken words growing larger. It was in that moment that David realized the true cost of his success. His ambition, his relentless drive to achieve more, had cost him something far more valuable: his connection with his son. Maria, still standing quietly by the side, finally spoke again. "I never meant to overstep, Mr. Sinclair. I just wanted to be there for him. That's all." David nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He understood now. Maria had not been a threat, but a bridge for his son when he had felt alone. The quiet act of rebellion, the small, unnoticed kindness that Maria had extended to Michael, had become the catalyst for the father to finally see his son's pain and to recognize his own failure to notice it. David knew that his relationship with Michael would never be the same, but perhaps, just perhaps, this was the moment they both needed to begin rebuilding it. Elena had been a maid for as long as she could remember, working tirelessly in the grand mansion of the Alder family. She had come from humble beginnings, raised in a small village where she learned the art of hard work, responsibility, and sacrifice from her own mother. But when she arrived at the Alder estate, it became clear that her life would always be marked by servitude, her dreams and desires pushed aside to accommodate the whims of the family she worked for. The Alders, wealthy and influential, rarely noticed her. She was just another invisible figure in the background, cleaning, cooking, and ensuring everything ran smoothly behind closed doors. Her focus, however, was not on the glamorous life the family led, but on one particular child: Tommy Alder, a boy no older than 7. Tommy, unlike his privileged siblings, was different. He was quiet, withdrawn, and sensitive to the world around him, traits that made him an easy target for the cruelty that sometimes seeped through the cracks of the Alder household. Elena noticed early on that Tommy seemed to carry a weight far beyond his years. His parents, busy with their socialite lives, were often absent, leaving the boy to navigate the cold, impersonal walls of their mansion alone. His older siblings, spoiled and reckless, would frequently taunt him, calling him weak or odd, and their harsh words left deep scars on the boy's heart. Elena, who had seen her own share of hardship, recognized the pain in Tommy's eyes. There was something about him that reminded her of her younger self, the quiet, internalized hurt that could never be expressed. In the beginning, she did little more than offer him a kind glance or a quick word of comfort when the opportunity arose. But over time, as she observed the growing isolation in his world, Elena became determined to protect Tommy, even if it meant putting herself at risk. One winter evening, as the Alders hosted a grand party to impress their social circle, Elena overheard a conversation that would change everything. The Alder children were in the next room, laughing and playing, their voices echoing down the long hallway. But the sound of Tommy crying quietly behind the closed door caught Elena's attention. Without hesitation, she rushed toward the noise, finding the young boy huddled in a corner of the dark room. His face was red from crying, and his body trembled with fear. He had been caught in a fight with his older brother, who, as usual, had called him worthless and weak. Elena could see the boy's spirit breaking with each passing insult, the weight of loneliness pressing down on him in a way that words could hardly capture. She knelt beside him, her heart aching. "It's okay, Tommy," she whispered gently, "they don't know what they're saying. You are not weak. You are strong." But Tommy didn't respond. His tear-filled eyes only stared at the ground as if the world had already abandoned him. Elena felt a wave of protectiveness she had never known before. She knew that if she didn't do something, the boy would be lost in a sea of neglect and cruelty. She carefully wrapped her arms around him, offering him the warmth and care he had so desperately needed but never received. It was a simple act, but to Tommy, it felt like the first time he wasn't invisible in the world. From that moment, Elena made it her silent mission to shield Tommy from the harshness of the world around him. She began to offer him small gestures of kindness, packing his favorite snacks when his parents forgot, offering him books to read in the quiet corners of the mansion, and teaching him how to care for the garden outside, a place where they could talk without anyone overhearing. Their bond grew in quiet ways, invisible to everyone but them. Over time, however, Elena's protectiveness began to draw the attention of others. The Alder family was not blind to the shift in the dynamic. Tommy's behavior began to change. He was more confident, more willing to speak up, to stand tall in the face of his siblings' ridicule. He found a quiet strength in the protection Elena offered, a safe space where he could be himself. But this newfound confidence did not sit well with his family. They noticed Tommy's shift in attitude, and with it, the boy began to push back against the behavior of his older siblings. One evening, as the family sat together at dinner, Tommy spoke up for the first time in a long while, defending himself against an accusation made by his older sister. The tension in the room was palpable, and as soon as Tommy's words left his mouth, his parents' eyes narrowed. They were not pleased. The next day, Elena overheard a conversation between Mr. Alder and a family friend. The tone of their words was harsh, filled with disdain. "There's something wrong with that boy," Mr. Alder said, his voice low. "He's been acting out, and I suspect the maid has something to do with it." Elena's heart sank. She knew this moment was coming. She had been careful, but nothing ever stayed hidden for long in a household like the Alders. If the family discovered the bond she had formed with Tommy, it could spell trouble for both of them. But Elena's decision had already been made. She would not stand idly by and watch Tommy fall apart. That night, as she tucked Tommy into bed, she whispered one last reassurance. "You're not alone, Tommy. I'll always be here for you." The next morning, after a long and tense conversation with Mr. Alder, Elena was let go from her position. She left the mansion, not with regret, but with a sense of peace. Tommy had changed. He was no longer the scared, silent boy she had once met. His confidence had bloomed, and though the road ahead was still long and uncertain, Elena knew that their bond, no matter how silent, had been the catalyst for his transformation. Many years later, when Tommy had grown into a strong and kind young man, he found Elena again, not as a maid, but as someone who had saved him from the isolation of his past. He had never forgotten the silent bond in a grand, ivy-clad estate nestled on the outskirts of a wealthy city. There lived a young woman named Rose, a black maid whose life was defined by a quiet strength and a deep, unwavering sense of responsibility. Rose had come to the estate when she was only 16, after her mother had fallen ill and needed urgent care. Over the years, she became more than just a maid to the family. She became a constant, a source of warmth and compassion, trusted with the care of the household and its members. Yet, it was not her tasks that defined Rose's place in the home, but the quiet bond she shared with her charge, Amelia, a young girl who was the daughter of the estate's wealthy owners. Amelia had been a curious, compassionate child from a young age, often seeking out Rose's company when she felt lonely or confused by the complexities of a world that seemed so divided. Amelia's parents, though kind, were distant, busy with their own concerns and social obligations. Rose, however, understood the pain of loneliness, and through their shared moments in the kitchen, or while walking the gardens, the two formed an unexpected connection. They would speak of things Amelia didn't feel she could share with her parents, the questions she had about the world, the feeling of being different from her peers, and the worries that kept her awake at night. Rose listened attentively, offering words of wisdom that spoke not just to Amelia's youthful concerns, but to the universal struggle of finding one's place in the world. Yet, as close as they became, Rose never allowed herself to forget her role, her position in the family. She remained steadfast in her duties, always maintaining a respectful distance, even when Amelia's fondness for her grew stronger. However, everything changed one rainy evening when a crisis struck the estate, one that would test both Rose's loyalty and her courage in ways she had never imagined. Amelia, then 16, was caught in the midst of a sudden, violent storm. The family had been attending a formal dinner in the city, leaving Amelia home alone. Rose had stayed behind to finish her work and was just about to head to her quarters when the wind picked up, howling against the windows, and the rain came down in sheets, making the garden paths treacherous and the air thick with an ominous energy. It wasn't long before Rose heard a frantic knock on the kitchen door. Her heart lurched as she rushed to answer. Standing there, drenched and pale, was Amelia. Her clothes were soaked through, her face drawn with fear. "Rose," she gasped, her voice trembling. I was in the study, and the windows." Before Amelia could finish, Rose saw the panic in her eyes. The storm had broken the windows in the study, sending glass shards everywhere. Amelia had tried to move them, but the winds had made it impossible for her to escape. Worse, a falling piece of the shattered window had cut her arm, and the blood was beginning to seep through the fabric of her dress. Rose's heart pounded in her chest. She instinctively moved to her side, guiding Amelia into the kitchen and assessing the wound with swift hands. The cut wasn't deep, but it was enough to cause concern. But it wasn't the injury that terrified Rose, it was the state of panic Amelia was in. Amelia's breathing was shallow, her eyes wide with fear, and it was clear to Rose that the young girl was struggling with more than just physical pain. Amelia had always been anxious, but the severity of the storm, combined with the isolation, had triggered something deeper within her. "Amelia, breathe, darling," Rose said softly, her voice calm but firm. She wrapped a cloth around the wound to staunch the bleeding, her hands moving with practiced care. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." Amelia's chest heaved as she tried to control her sobs. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die alone. I thought no one would come." Rose's heart clenched as she knelt beside her, her hand resting on Amelia's trembling shoulders. "You'll never be alone, Amelia. I'm here," she said, her words steady and reassuring. "I will always be here when you need me. You're never alone, no matter what happens." The storm raged outside, but in that moment, the noise of the world fell away, leaving only the quiet exchange between the two. Rose's mind was clear, her actions precise as she tended to Amelia's wound, but it was her unwavering presence, her commitment to staying calm, to providing Amelia with the reassurance she so desperately needed that made all the difference. As the storm continued to howl outside, Rose remained by Amelia's side, holding her hand, offering comfort until Amelia's breath began to steady. Rose didn't know how long it had been, but eventually, Amelia stopped trembling and leaned into her. "Thank you, Rose," she whispered, her voice small but filled with a deep sense of gratitude. Rose smiled softly, brushing a damp lock of hair from Amelia's forehead. "You don't have to thank me," she said quietly. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what." When the storm finally subsided and Amelia's parents returned home, they found their daughter safe and sound, though exhausted from the emotional toll of the evening. They praised Rose for her quick thinking and her dedication, but the words they spoke could never capture the depth of the bond that had been forged that night. For Amelia, it wasn't just the physical care she received that mattered, it was Rose's presence, her calming influence, and the assurance that in a moment of crisis, someone had truly seen her, truly cared for her. For Rose, it was the realization that, in the most critical moment of Amelia's life, her compassion and unwavering support had not only saved a life, but had deepened a relationship that no one could ever take away. It was in that moment, as the storm passed and the dawn began to break, that Rose understood the true power of her care, not just in the actions she took, but in the love and loyalty she gave, without question, to the one person who had always trusted her. James had always been a man of certainty, his life built on clear lines drawn in the sand, his way, or no way at all. As a father, he approached parenting with the same rigid mindset, believing that discipline, structure, and his own hard-won success were the keys to shaping a future for his son, Ethan. Ethan, however, was not like James. He was quiet, introspective, with an artist's heart, always more at home with a paintbrush in his hand than with a baseball bat or a boardroom presentation. The father and son had never truly understood one another, their differences only widening with each passing year. James would often find himself frustrated by Ethan's reluctance to embrace the real world, unable to grasp why his son wasn't more like the boys he knew, loud, confident, and always striving for the next big achievement. But Ethan had never wanted to be like anyone else. He wasn't rebellious, not in the way James thought of rebellion, but simply different, a quiet soul who saw the world in shades of color and emotion, not black and white. This fundamental disconnect between father and son had always simmered under the surface, creating a space that, over time, had grown colder and more distant. But it wasn't until the day Ethan's protector walked into their lives that everything came to a head. It happened one evening when James, after a long day of meetings, returned home to find his son sitting at the dinner table, eyes swollen, face blotchy from crying. Across from him sat a young man, tall, with a calm but steely presence. His name was Ben. James hadn't seen Ben before, but there was something about him, a quiet authority, an unwavering sense of loyalty that James couldn't quite place. Ethan's eyes flickered to the door when James entered, his face flushing with embarrassment. But Ben didn't look away. Instead, he stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Reynolds," Ben said, his voice steady, but warm. "I think it's time we talk." James got twisted in an unfamiliar way. Who was this person to his son? And why had Ethan allowed him into their home? Without shaking Ben's hand, James turned his gaze to Ethan. "What's going on here, Ethan?" he demanded, his voice sharp, his tone filled with confusion and irritation. Ethan's eyes dropped to the table. Ben took a deep breath, stepping forward, knowing that this moment would not be easy. "Ethan's been going through something," he said carefully, his eyes meeting James with the kind of calm resolve James had never expected from someone so young. "Something he hasn't been able to tell you. But I've been there for him. I've been protecting him." The words hung in the air, thick with a silence that seemed to stretch forever. James' brow furrowed. "Protecting him from what?" he asked, his voice betraying a mixture of skepticism and anger. "I don't need anyone protecting my son. I've been providing for him, I've been giving him everything he needs. He doesn't need some stranger to step in and do what I've been doing his whole life." Ben's gaze softened but didn't waver. "No, sir, with all due respect, you've been providing him with everything except what he truly needs. He needs someone who understands him, someone who sees him for who he is, not what you want him to be. That's what I've been doing." The words cut through James like a blade. He had always believed that his way was the right way, that his financial stability, his achievements, and his efforts were enough to shape Ethan into the man he hoped he would be. But Ben's words, simple and honest, made him question everything. He turned back to Ethan, whose eyes were filled with something James hadn't seen in years: vulnerability, fear, and an unmistakable sense of relief. For the first time, Ethan was being seen for who he truly was, not who his father had wanted him to be. "Ethan," James said, his voice quieter now, but tinged with frustration. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me?" Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke. "Because you never listened, Dad. You never saw me. All you ever saw was your idea of who I should be. I was drowning in it. And Ben, he's the only one who ever really listened." The weight of Ethan's words hit James like a thunderclap. He hadn't realized how deep the divide had become, how far he had drifted from the very person he had promised to protect. He had been so wrapped up in his vision of success, so consumed by his idea of what Ethan's life should look like, that he had missed the small, quiet signs that his son was slipping away. Ben wasn't just a protector, he was the bridge between James' world and the world Ethan so desperately needed. The anger that had burned in James' chest began to smolder, replaced by something else: shame. Shame for not seeing his son's pain. Shame for not understanding the unspoken cries for help. He looked at Ben, then at Ethan, and for the first time, he truly saw them both not as roles he had assigned them, but as people. "I didn't know," James said softly, his voice breaking in a way he hadn't expected. "I didn't know I was doing that to you, Ethan." Ethan's eyes softened, and for the first time in years, the weight between them seemed to shift. Ben gave them both a small nod before stepping back. "I'll leave you two to talk. But know this, Mr. Reynolds, sometimes the hardest thing for a parent to do is to realize that their child doesn't need their protection, but their understanding." As the door clicked shut behind Ben, James sat across from his son, the silence between them no longer filled with tension but with the beginning of something new, a moment of confrontation that would, in time, heal the space between them. Lily had always been a quiet presence in the grand mansion of the Carsons, a family whose wealth and status cast a long shadow over the small, humble life she had left behind. As a maid, she was invisible to most of the household, her days filled with chores and routines, but her heart had always been attuned to the one person who needed her protection more than anyone else: young Ethan Carson. Ethan, only 8 years old, was born with a rare neurological condition that left him unable to walk or speak, a fragile soul in a world that often overlooked those who were different. His mother, a woman of high society and sharp expectations, was preoccupied with her social image, leaving Ethan in the care of the household staff, often neglecting the emotional and physical needs of her son. Lily, however, saw beyond the boy's disability. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he flinched when loud voices echoed through the halls, the way his small hands trembled when no one was there to comfort him. Lily had a deep understanding of loneliness, of being unseen, and it connected her to Ethan in a way that no one else in the house could understand. Day after day, she would find herself in Ethan's room, sitting quietly by his side, offering him a small toy to hold or simply resting her hand on his, providing him with a warmth he desperately needed but rarely received. But one cold afternoon, everything changed. Lily was finishing up her cleaning duties when she heard raised voices from the other side of the mansion. The sound of harsh words echoed through the hallways, and then, unexpectedly, she heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy being thrown, followed by a loud crash. Panic surged through her as she knew the source of the commotion. Ethan's mother was in one of her moods again. Lily had seen this before: the cold, dismissive way Mrs. Carson treated Ethan whenever she was frustrated with him. The boy, vulnerable and unable to defend himself, had been subjected to more than one moment of neglect or harsh words from his mother. The tension had always simmered beneath the surface, but this time, it felt different, dangerous. Without thinking, Lily sprinted toward Ethan's room. Her heart raced as she passed through the mansion's long corridors, her mind racing with the possibilities of what could be happening behind those closed doors. As she reached Ethan's room, she saw the door slightly ajar, and through the crack, she could make out Mrs. Carson, standing near Ethan's bed, her face flushed with frustration. Ethan, sitting in his wheelchair, looked up at his mother with eyes that seemed to be pleading for something, anything to make the pain stop. But it wasn't just his mother's neglect that was the danger, it was the way she was speaking to him, her words sharp and cutting, as if she were speaking to an inconvenience rather than a child. Lily knew she had to act fast. She didn't know what exactly was going to happen, but she knew that Ethan's safety, both physical and emotional, was at risk. Without hesitation, she knocked gently on the door before pushing it open, standing tall in the doorway. Mrs. Carson spun around, her eyes flashing with irritation. "What is it, Lily? Can't you see I'm dealing with something important here?" she snapped, her voice dripping with condescension. Lily didn't flinch. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, and her voice was calm but firm. "Ma'am, I think it's time for you to step away. Ethan needs a break." Mrs. Carson, stunned by Lily's directness, stood frozen for a moment. Then, with a sharp exhale, she walked past Lily without saying another word, her frustration clearly simmering beneath the surface. She didn't seem to care about the damage she had done physically or emotionally. As she left the room, Lily locked eyes with Ethan, whose face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. He had been waiting for someone, anyone, to step in, to offer him the protection he had been denied for so long. In that moment, Lily made a vow to herself she would never let him feel abandoned again. She would become his shield, his protector. Lily stayed by Ethan's side that day, sitting with him in silence, offering comfort in the form of her presence. As the hours passed, she gently rocked his wheelchair back and forth, humming a soft lullaby she had once sung to her own younger siblings, a melody filled with hope and love. Ethan's body relaxed, his anxiety slowly melting away under Lily's care. From that moment on, something shifted in the household. Wordlessly, Lily began to assume a new role in Ethan's life. She ensured that every time his mother became distant or harsh, she was there to intervene, stepping in as the protective presence he so desperately needed. She wasn't just his maid, she was his lifeline, the one person who refused to look away, the one who saw him for who he truly was, a vulnerable child deserving of love and safety. Over time, Ethan's condition improved, not because of medical treatments, but because of the steady love and compassion that Lily provided. He began to trust again, and in the quiet moments when she would stroke his hair or speak softly to him, his body relaxed, his eyes filled with gratitude. The mansion, once a place of cold indifference, transformed into a home, a place where safety was no longer a privilege but a right. Lily had protected him not just physically, but emotionally, and in doing so, she had given him a gift no one else could, a sense of worth and dignity that would last a lifetime. In the end, it wasn't wealth or status that had made the difference in Ethan's life. It was the quiet strength of a maid who saw a boy in need, who stood up to protect him when no one else would. Maria had been working as a maid for the Alvarez family for nearly 5 years, a quiet presence in their lavish home. At first, her role had seemed simple enough, cleaning the grand house, preparing meals, and making sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes. The family, led by Victor Alvarez, a successful businessman, seemed to have it all: wealth, status, and a seemingly perfect life. His wife, Elena, was beautiful, elegant, and effortlessly poised, while their 2 children, Sophie and Daniel, were well-mannered and excelling in school. Maria, who had come from a humble background, had always kept her distance, working diligently to maintain her role as the help, rarely interacting with the family beyond what was necessary. She had always respected their privacy, understanding that her place was to serve, not to question or involve herself in their personal lives. However, everything changed one evening when Victor came home early, his face pale, his eyes vacant, and his steps heavy with an emotion Maria had never seen before. Elena, who had been entertaining guests just hours earlier, barely seemed to notice. She stood in the kitchen, sorting through some papers, when she noticed Victor's disheveled appearance. Before she could ask what had happened, he crumpled to the floor in front of her, sobbing uncontrollably. The sudden collapse of the strong, stoic man shocked Elena, who dropped everything to kneel beside him, her face pale with fear. For the first time in years, the veneer of their perfect life shattered. Maria, who had been in the next room, had no intention of intruding, but the sounds of Victor's distress filled the house, a deep, guttural cry that echoed through the walls. She knew something had happened, something that had shaken the very foundation of the family. At first, Maria stayed in the background, unsure of whether she should be involved. But when she saw Sophie and Daniel, both standing at the doorway with confusion and fear in their eyes, she couldn't stay away. The children, who had always been taught to see their parents as the pillars of strength, were visibly shaken, their innocent faces clouded by uncertainty. Without thinking, Maria stepped forward and gently guided the children away from the scene, her calming presence the only thing that seemed to ground them. As they sat together in the quiet of the living room, Sophie, who was just 12, clung to Maria, whispering, "What's wrong with Daddy?" Daniel, younger but just as perceptive, asked, "Is he going to be okay?" Maria, unsure of how to answer, simply hugged them both tightly, offering what little comfort she could. She had seen the family in many different lights during her time working there, but never like this. As the evening wore on, the truth began to emerge. Victor's company had faced a massive financial crisis, a bad investment, a lost partnership, and a series of poor decisions had sent him into a downward spiral. The weight of the failure had crushed him, and he couldn't bear to face the family he had worked so hard to build his life around. Elena, who had always been the picture of grace, had been too shocked to process her own feelings, but her fear was unmistakable. The fear that the life they had built together was crumbling, that their children's future was uncertain, and that Victor might not recover from this. Maria, who had always kept her distance, found herself in a position she never imagined. She had always seen her role as that of a caretaker, someone who kept the house running smoothly, but now, in the face of the family's crisis, she realized that her presence could offer something more. She began to take on an unexpected role, not just as a maid but as a pillar of emotional support. In the days that followed, as Victor withdrew deeper into himself, Maria became the steady hand that guided the family through their darkest days. She was the one who sat with Sophie and Daniel when their parents were too overwhelmed to talk. She was the one who cooked meals, not with the usual precision of routine, but with a softness that conveyed care and love. And slowly, as time passed, her understanding of the family's dynamics deepened. She saw how Elena, who had once seemed so perfect, was unraveling beneath the pressure of their reality. She witnessed the cracks in their carefully constructed world, but also the potential for healing. It was Maria who encouraged Elena to seek help when she noticed her growing anxiety, reminding her that strength didn't just come from holding everything together but also from accepting vulnerability. It was Maria who helped Sophie and Daniel process their fear, helping them understand that sometimes things go wrong, but love and family would always pull them through. She became a confidant, someone who offered a different perspective, a grounding presence amidst the storm. As weeks passed, the Alvarez family began to heal, piece by piece. Victor, though still struggling, started to seek therapy and counseling. Elena became more open with her feelings, and the children, who had been scared and confused, found comfort in knowing that things would eventually be okay, even if it took time. The family's bonds, though shaken, began to grow stronger, and with Maria's quiet yet unwavering support, they were able to navigate the crisis with resilience. Maria, who had once seen herself as an outsider, had become an integral part of the family's healing process. Through her actions, she had shifted from merely protecting the family's outward appearance to understanding and nurturing their inner strength. She had become more than just the maid, she had become the heart of the family when they needed it the most. In the end, Maria's role had evolved far beyond the cleaning of rooms and preparation of meals. She had become a reminder that in times of crisis, what truly holds a family together isn't wealth or status, but love, understanding, and the quiet strength of those who choose to stand by each other when the world seems to be falling apart.